Welcome to the Olympia Clinic for March. We're part of the 4th Division PNR. I'm not going to talk much longer. I'm going to turn it over to our speaker tonight. It's Bill Busacca. Bill's going to give us a presentation on tuning up brass locomotives and a couple other little pieces.
Thanks to Greg and Brian for inviting me. And I'm getting a little bit of a spring allergy, so if I yell too loud or am too gravelly with my voice, just let me know so you can understand me. This all started about because I'm not the perfect track layer like a few of my friends. Dale Crutcher in particular and Brian Ellerby were terrific track layers. I'm not bad. I use a lot of flex track. And one of the interesting things that happens is because my layout has been done sort of by scenes, Rico, Colorado, Dolores, Colorado, and some of the other scenes. And then when you put them together, you know, it's all nice when you start from a Benchwork to begin with, and then you lay the sub roadbed and then the homestead and then the track. You know, you're pretty good. And if you're, I know it's a horrible time to buy good lumber, but if you started out with good dry lumber and all that jazz, yeah, you may have less problems. My biggest problems are between modules. So I started perfecting the locomotives, you know, and I was started to think in terms of pre-keep alives. You know, keep alives are wonderful things, but you know, you just got to get the juice to the locomotive to begin with. And I learned this lesson the hard way about a year ago when I made Casey Jones for Dan Peisel in Albuquerque. Now I do have to admit that Kelly Morris did all the brass work. So then I had to put the mechanism in there. We used a flea, an SN3 flea with a flywheel on it. That was great. The problem was Casey Jones had an outside frame front truck instead of an inside frame. Even though I donated a goose truck to make Casey Jones, the geese had frames on the inside so I could put wipers on the front truck. So I had to get all the pickup off of the 2 drive wheels. And when I first started doing Casey Jones, it would coffin buck and coffin buck and coffin buck. And I thought I was going crazy. And no one had ever talked before about the fact that keep alive has to be filled up like a gas tank. I didn't ever hear anybody talk about that. And I didn't actually hear that phrase until I was in Albuquerque last August and went on a layout tour in Santa Fe where a guy was who ran the layout was an electrical engineer. So, well, of course you have to fill up a keep alive. Well, no one else had said that. So that's where I sort of mentally was starting from is I hate things to come off the track, hate things to short, hate things to have discontinuities. So the first thing you got to deal with is just getting juice to the thing. And this is one of the greater things that PBO came out with. A guy named Jack Waldron down in Texas made these phosphor bronze wipers. The one you see on the truck there is a little bit oxidized. The good news is about phosphor bronze, the oxidation products of phosphor bronze still conduct electricity. The biggest, craziest thing with locomotives is, with steam engines, is that neither white metal nor brass, the oxide of neither one of those metals will conduct electricity. So I found that one of the, because I had some C's and T's, consolidations, and you know, and also some 10-wheelers, and they would act real funky after they'd been sitting for a few months. And I somehow finally figured out that what I had to do is get out something that I'm not sure everybody's got available because I'm a retired dentist. So I had these rubber wheels that were impregnated with abrasive. So basically I polished all the bolster pivots on all my tenders and all my trucks. And that's kind of what you're seeing here is polished, you know, bolsters. And here's a better version. So when I ran out of Jack Waldron phosphor bronze wipers, which were wonderful, these things that went over the bolster pivot and everything else, you can make your own. You need 3/1000 phosphor bronze. You solder them to the bolster. When I did my operating caboose lights, what I did there is I did a combination of super glue and epoxy. I put some epoxy on there, press it down, and super glue it in a different spot so while the epoxy set up. But basically the 3/1000 phosphor bronze works great. And what you get is now you have, 8 points of contact on your tender instead of 4. And if you look at this one closely, what you'll see is the wipers are slowly sort of burnished over the axles. And so what they end up doing is creating a much larger surface area for contact. I would never recommend using, some people have, and there are times when people use phosphor bronze wire. The problem is you have such a tiny little contact space. I don't think they're nearly as reliable as you would like. The other thing that I have a little burr in my saddle about is equalized trucks. Now, agreed that PBO wanted to do something really neat, and I'm not knocking PBO because they bring in phenomenal locomotives. So that is in no way, because when these equalized trucks were made by the engineers in Asia, what we are stuck with the reality of our scale, and that is our cars don't weigh 3 pounds. I think these trucks would equalize really well if each car weighed 3 pounds and you polished the bolster side frame interface so that it was as smooth as silk. Then maybe you'd get an equalized truck. So what I've done is either use super glue, or in the case of plastic trucks, side frames and bolsters, I use 50/50 MEK and ACC. Now I know MEK is another organic chemical. It's not so great. I use 3 drops of the liquid, styrene cement in a eyeglass with 3 drops of ACC, and I put it on with a pin. So you're not going to scramble your brains by using that much MEK. What you do is you make a really, really good bond between the styrene side frame and the bolster. Here's another trick. So I've rigidized not only every tender truck, I have rigidized, and I'm going to do an advancement on this slideshow for the National Narrow Gauge, because I've done that with every single freight truck. I rigidized the side frame and the bolster on every single one, setting them on level track to begin with, one truck at a time, so they set up. And then I adjust all the flex with the truck mount screw. So there's only about a 20 or 30 degree play in the trucks, so that one, you can re-rail them when you need to. And the other thing is that you just need a little bit of flex. Some people like to have one rigid truck and one floppy truck. I don't know. I mean, it may work for some people, but I found just about 20 degrees of flex is just enough, adjusted with the truck mount screw. But you can see on this tender that I've gone a little berserk here. And those who make contest models are probably rolling over in their proverbial graves looking at what I've done to these tender trucks. And the reason I do that is that the engineers that made these models, and they are wonderful models, they're only thinking in terms of running it back and forth on straight level track on your mantle. They don't think about a real layout. And the fact that you have transitions to grades and you're going through turnouts with funky frogs and Lord knows what all else. So what I have done is that, and the engineers and their lack of being model railroaders made these big head screws. So these big head screws don't allow the tender trucks to flex. So what's happening is that you're either losing continuity or you're going to derail, one or the other. So this is kind of shows you what I've done. And I didn't invent this idea of rigidized trucks so much as a number of years ago, about a decade ago at least, PBL came out with these Delrin 3-foot 7-inch arch bar narrow gauge trucks, one piece. And the great thing is that once you get them properly adjusted with a truck mount screw, these babies stay on the track. They don't do anything funky, because one of the problems with the friction between the side frame and the bolster is all it takes is about 20 thousandths of set, where you go over some irregular part of the track, maybe the wood warped or the moisture changed in your layout room. And so the truck takes a set, and then it comes to the next frog and derails. So you can see the difference between the two, the old quote unquote equalized truck. And of course, we all know now about plastic wheels and the fact that they don't work nearly as well over time as metal wheels. Here's, that same locomotive again, and with the wipers on it and the trucks so that they can flex. In this case, even though the bolster is really wide, it seems to me that there's a small shank or something on this screw that allows this truck to flex. So you got to play it. Each tender that you come to, you got to figure out just how much flex you got, how much you have to adjust the bolsters and whatever else. Here's an interesting little thing. I think if we were in elementary school and the teacher took a vote, and we had to put our heads down and take a vote. Those little red dots are so I don't put the tender trucks on backwards. I have to say that I bet every model railroader at some point in their career has put a tender truck on backwards. And I get so annoyed with myself that I do that I put red dot for the ground side on the bottom of the tender on the bolster on the trucks. So I always put the trucks on the right way around. I'm sure no one else has ever done that. So here are the rubber wheels I use to polish gold crowns. Nobody wants gold crown anymore. They want porcelain, but regardless. You only have to polish the tires on tenders about once a year, maybe once every 2 years. And you don't even have to clean your track with a Bright Boy. If you just take some electrical cleaner and put it on a track cleaning car, and you'll see that in a minute. Just cleaning the gunk off the tender wheels about once a year is plenty. And you can see that my finger is dragging on the opposite insulated side wheel. So there's a certain amount of the wheel, otherwise the axle is going to turn so fast that the rubber wheel is not going to polish that, grounded side wheel. Same thing here, just another angle, same thing, dragging my finger on the insulated side wheel. And now we're going to talk about stay alive circuits, which have been a godsend for all of us. But here's Casey Jones in the middle of me trying to add the electronics to the body, and the cowl was done by Bob Sloan decades ago. And Kelly Morris, in his incredible crafting, made that frame, made the roof, put it all together. And I gave him a Goose front truck, and that is an SN3 flea with a flywheel. That brass shield is to keep the wiring from getting sucked into the flywheel. And so then I had to deal with how the devil am I going to get a keep alive in this doggone tiny little thing. You see in the roof there, inside the roof is a sugar cube speaker that I think Larry Close gave me, and the Tsunami. And the only thing that would fit in there is a KA1 keep alive. And TCS makes that. There's some great keep alives from Soundtracks, but they're big, they're huge. But they do work great. I've got a number 1 scratch-built Goose and a number 6 PBL Goose. And with geese like that, those keep alives are great because they actually store enough electricity to run it for almost a minute. In this case, the KA1s keep, there's about 11 seconds of juice, which in reality is usually enough. The biggest problem with Casey was this, the fact that I told you that we had to have an outside frame front truck on Casey Jones, couldn't put wipers on it. So all the wipers we had were on the drive wheel. So those are kind of homemade phosphor bronze wipers. Well, the problem is that was the coffin buck era I went through. There's when you have a locomotive with, 4 axles and you've got 4 drivers and you've got 4 tender wheels and all that kind of jazz, you've got a lot more pickup. The problem with only 2 wheels of pickup, you haven't built up the keep alive long enough to keep that sucker running. So what I had to learn to do with Casey Jones, and you're gonna have to do this with a 2-truck Shay or any other rail bus you make, and that is you turn everything on. When you start hearing the sound system from your rail bus or your Shay or whatever you got, let it sit there for 45 seconds. What you're doing is you're filling the gas tank. You're filling the keep alive. And because I thought I was going to throw Casey against the wall or pull my hair out or do something about that time that I was in the coffin buck stage. And finally, I figured out that once you fill up that doggone keep alive, all these tiny little rail buses will run. So here, let's see if I can figure out how to make this. I want to show you Casey running. Sorry, for some reason, there isn't a little play arrow like there usually is. So we'll just have to move on. Sorry, you're not going to get to see Casey run. Sorry about that. So once you've finished doing your scenery, of course, you got to get out your bright boy and all the other things you can do to clean the track. And usually the only time I ever get out a bright boy after that is sometimes when there's a slight rail gap between pieces of rail, you might get a little bit of micro sparking there. And over a couple year period, you may get a little bit of oxidation right there. That's about the only thing you're going to have to clean with a bright boy, or if you do some more scenery. All I've done is that's a Walther's track cleaning car, and you normally put like some kind of fluid in it. I found that I just use the pads. I use Napa's, electrical cleaner, and it is trichloroethylene. It is one of the nastier organic chemicals. So I do put on nitro gloves, which do resist all organic solvents, and I just barely wet the pad. And then I have got the pad on. That's another Walther's track cleaner underneath a PBL boxcar. And let's see what happens now when I do the clean the track. So you'll notice the black streaks on the bottom of the track cleaner car. That's from about 10 feet. And reality is, if you've cleaned your track, once you've done your scenery, this is all you have to do after you haven't run your train for a while, or if everybody's coming over to operate in your house. They just take this locomotive cleaner from Napa, and about every 10 feet, with my nitro gloves on, take a shop towel and wipe the black streaks off the pad and lightly re-wet it with the locomotive cleaner. And that's all I do to my track. And that's all you need to do. You don't have to have hair clipper oil and all these other weird, voodoo concoctions. So let's talk about shorts, because that's the next nemesis. And here's a really strange one. A lot of you you have steam locomotives, but you don't necessarily have outside frame narrow gauge locomotives. And this is one that's really interesting. Took a while to find out. And by the way, I think the word is out there now that everybody knows, but I didn't know initially, that when you want to find a short, when you got an intermittent short, and there's nothing worse electrically than an intermittent short, is you turn the lights out and you run it and keep your eyes at eye level and watch that baby real closely. Somewhere usually on the left side, insulated side of the drivers or the tender or whatever, what you'll find is you'll see a little teensy spark in the dark. And in this particular case with this K locomotive, the front and rear of the 4 axles tend to have enough side play that the driver tires catch the inside of the outside frame, and then they short. So if you look real close on the other side of the rear axle, you'll see a little piece of 10 thousandths black styrene. And so what I do is use my ACC MEK mix, and I glue that in there, and you kind of go, oh my God, you've taken a contest model and you just ruined it. Oh God, that's ugly. Well, yeah, but it doesn't short. And if you see with the locomotive turned over, running this right side up, you're not going to see that little piece of black styrene. All you've got to do is keep that driver tire from touching the frame on the inside. And it's the same with the front axle too on these outside frames. And then I don't know whether I've got a picture of it, but the other thing that I've talked to Tom O'Hara, and he's a Tsunami installer in Bellingham that's really good. And he was talking about one of the great nemesis is 10-wheelers. That pilot truck tends to flop around a lot. And one of the classic things it does is the rear axle, the tires on the rear axle catch the inside rear corner of the cylinders. And either they derail or they short. And I've got a 10-wheeler that does real well, but horror of horrors, I've got a slight 45-degree cut with a carbide disc on the inside of that corner that's repainted so that it doesn't short anymore. So you just have to decide, is it going to sit on your mantle, or are you going to look at it, or are you going to run it? And then the next thing Oh, there you can see my shims. Those are my styrene shims there that I put on the inside of the left side of the outside frame Mikados. And we're going to talk now a little bit about pilot trucks and trailing trucks. And I've got my photo that will tell you what's going on. This is my neighbor, Dave. He's a boat guy. What else would you expect? Shorts and flip-flops, right? It's a boat guy. But what I want to impress with everybody is what the reality of trailing trucks and pilot trucks is. In a real locomotive, the trailing truck obviously supports a firebox. You want to put out more horsepower, you got a bigger firebox, make more steam. If you're not a yard switcher, if you want to go fast, you got a bigger pilot, you got a four-wheel pilot truck or a two-wheel pilot truck, and it guides the locomotive into corners. Matter of fact, I think I saw a Trains magazine issue where they have 484 that had a terrific front truck, four-wheel truck. And they called that, the net engine's nickname was the glider, because that pilot truck went in there. But both the pilot truck and the trailing truck support the frame. And so they are pressed down by the weight of the locomotive to stay on the track. My point of taking this photo is that our model pilot trucks and trailing trucks are flip-flops. They just go all over the place. So I use fishing weights, I use buckshot, I use almost anything I can. And I also have been known to grind the underside of the frame, which of course is also quite sacrilegious if you're a model builder for a contest model. But if you look real close where the frame meets the pilot, there is a very nice, beautiful casting of an L bracket. The problem with that is that oftentimes the flange on the pilot truck will catch that bracket and either short or derail. So it's been ground with a Dremel. Here you can see a trailing truck on K27s. I love K27s. But mechanically, the trailing trucks on 27s typically are horror shows. And you got to weight them and you got to clearance them and everything else in order to get them to work well. Especially if you're, switching and you're backing up through turnouts. Trailing trucks on, a lot of locomotives just flop around and they just cause all kinds of craziness when you're trying to switch. Here again, you can see, lots of weights added to the pilot and trailing trucks. And I think look at all the buckshot there on that trailing truck on that one. Anything to keep that, because it's dropping around the firebox there, or not the firebox, but the ash pit, or the place where the cinders go on the locomotive is surrounded by the bracket of the trailing truck, and so it doesn't have much weight. Here's a classic close-up of the bracket holding the pilot onto the frame. And sure, it's not pretty to look at like this. I always paint them so they don't short. But the point is that they're really good at derailing pilot trucks occasionally. And here's one of the uglier things I did. This is a Glenn Farley conversion of K27 to 455 after the wreck. So it's got its own snowplow on it. And the reason that I do that, and here's what it looks like when it's on the track. You can't see it. It's hidden. And one of my tricks to try to keep you from thinking about the fact that I've got all these, fishing weights under the snowplow is I put a fireman in there with a shovel full of coal, and that'll hopefully get your attention so you won't notice the weights underneath. And here you can see one of the other things that I try to do with pilot and trailing trucks is give them a lot of vertical flex. They don't need to flop around like mostly unscrewed freight trucks, but they need to have a certain amount of flexibility, because over time, I'll leave his name out, but one modeler who was on NNG a number of months ago talking about his layout has had to run a feeder wire to every single piece of rail on his layout because he's had so much trouble with discontinuities between rail. I fortunately solder all my rails together, but I can get away with that because I'm in a second story room above a garage that's got radiant floor heat. So what I have going for me is consistent temperatures and consistent humidity. And the problem is, I guess that this man, who's a great modeler, you know, if I mention his name, we'd all know who he is in a daylight basement or something like that, that has a lot of moisture changes and a lot of temperature changes. And I've only had one rail pop during a heat wave one time on one of my sidings in Dolores, which is a sort of the classic heat thing. But in general, I've sort of soldered everything together so that I have at least rail continuity. And here's a photograph, I think it was in Trains magazine, and I couldn't help but use this photograph. This is, I think it's in northern Idaho, as I recall. It's a branch line, obviously. And it takes a crew 12 hours to go, I don't know, 60 miles. I don't remember the fine print. But you can look at that rail there, and you know, you can't imagine that that locomotive can go more than 10 miles an hour if it's lucky. And those are the realities of wood that shrinks and wood that changes, temperature, humidity, and all those things that can happen. And that's why I've spent all this time in these locomotives, because the reality is, yeah, if you're obsessive like some of my good friends and make perfect track with perfect bench work, that's great. But the reality is we live in a real world and things happen. So this is one of the things that I've done, is tried to buy, and I'm sorry the price of lumber has gone through the roof, even though I live in Shelton, of course, that is straight grain dry lumber for the bench work, just because it's hard enough to make sure everything works well all the time. The last thing you need to do is have your bench work and your track work change. And this is one of my problems where Rico meets the Rico Y and Rico Tipple. And that is because they're two different, completely different modules. And there was just enough change there that I've had some issues with verticality. And typically when things change, it's the verticalities that drive you the craziest. I mean, you can get out your NMRA gauge and you can do all that stuff, but if bench work shifts and different portions of your layout shift, then you got verticality issues. And here's the reason that 455 after the wreck that Glenn Farley did has got all those fishing weights under it, is that Dale Kreutzer taught me a lesson. The locomotives are balanced over the center of the drivers, can pull a whole lot more cars because all the force is centered right there on the drive axles. So I use a double evergreen styrene tubing for a 10-wheeler, or you use, and here's the 10-wheeler balanced, you know, so that you get really good traction. Or if you've got, you know, consolidation, then you're going to use a single tube because you got to be centered over the 4 axles. And regardless, that it makes a huge difference in their pulling power. And there's why all those ugly fishing weights are under the pilot, you know, the snowplow on the 27. Turns out that you find out when you do balance locomotives, the C's and T's tend to be light in the cab. So the cab roof has got all kinds of, you know, flat weights in it and buckshot and Lord knows else, whatever you want to put up there. And typically with the K's, you know, they tend to be light in the firebox. I mean, not the firebox, the smoke box, sorry, in the smoke box end. So you've got to weight the front of K's. And, you know, this is a duplicate of the one I showed you earlier. And this is, you know, once it's on the track, what you're worried about is its pulling power and it's avoiding derailments, shorts, and electrical discontinuities. This is a K37, which is the largest narrow gauge, you know, Mikado that was made in Colorado. And that's a 28-inch radius in SN3. So as I was on vacation in February, the first 2 weeks of February, and I came home on Monday, we're lucky enough to be able to be in Hawaii for 2 weeks. And then Joel Shank's layout was open the following Saturday. And I thought my wife was going to clean my clock. I said, I'm getting on a plane on Friday and I'm flying down to Palm Springs to see this guy's terrain layout. But you'll have to see the slides here to realize that these kind of layout like this just isn't on every street corner. This guy's layout's been down there, I think, 20, 25 years. The building's about 30 by 30. It's in the middle of the Imperial Valley, out in the middle of Dinktuli, nowhere. The man has created a layout that's like two hands with the fingers interlocking so that there are loops all over the place. I've never seen how much layout you can get in one 30 by 30 foot building that isn't like just massive, Penn Central train yards. I mean, this is Colorado narrow gauge scenery. And this is Ridgeway. And for those of you that know the Rio Grande Southern, Joel is very fortunate. We don't always get to be as lucky as Joel has been. Joel is the engineering, exacting, scientific type. He partnered up with a man who was an artist. All of the backdrops you see are painted by this artist. This is before all the kits, all of the rags to riches kits and all the other kits were built. All these buildings in Rico and in, Ophir were all scratch built by Joel. And then his artist friend weathered everything. I mean, it's just about as good as it gets. So this is Ridgeway, Colorado. There's the roundhouse. And again, those are all hand-painted backdrops that this artist did. They're just amazing. This is before there was a kit to build the Ridgeway roundhouse. I know that I happen to be lucky enough to have the Rico Depot built by Mike Blasick, and it has 12,000 individual shingles. This is before strip shingles had been invented. So this is the day when you scratch build something, you realize scratch build it. And for those of you that know the Rio Grande Southern, this is Placerville, the station and the warehouses. The San Miguel River is right there in the foreground, just out of the picture. I'm picky enough of it as an RGS guy. There was actually some horizontal red sandstone behind Placerville, but the backdrop is so spectacularly painted, I'll shut up and I won't criticize it. And here's a full shot, backed up a little bit of Placerville, and shows you what wonderful, you're really just sucked right into the scene. And this is Vance Junction. This was between Placerville and Lizard Head. This is a scene I'm sorry I never got to do because I did a different section of the RGS. What this artist did for him, I'm sorry the picture is not bigger, but if you look real close at the shiplap, there's little chunks missing from the boards and, the streaky weathering and all that kind of jazz. And that's the way that Joel, he used all of his precision skills to make all these models. And then his artist friend weathered them up. And that is actually a coach that was used as kind of the quasi station for ages. And there's just a great amount of scenery with the junk and everything else and the galloping goose. Lots of bridges. This is an interesting scene. I believe that is the Rico engine house, but there's an aisle, the second bridge in the background. Between that bridge and the Rico engine house is an aisleway. And so it's a little interesting. This is just the spectacular RGS scenery. All of us that have seen the pictures, just our jaws just drop. And this is a picture of Ophir, Colorado. Ophir is one of the more well-known places on the Rio Grande Southern. It was considered quite an engineering marvel at the time because they were trying to get up over Lizard Head Pass, and there was too much of an elevation change. So what they did is they went up a side creek and then went on this bridge and then came back across above the line that came up this side creek to gain enough elevation to get over Lizard Head Pass. The interesting thing about Ophir is it was a mining town. You can see the loading building there where they loaded the cars. But this scene is so well done. It looks like an actual photograph taken in the 40s. And I'm an RGS nut here, and that's how I feel about it. I feel like this is almost a prototypical photo. And here's a close-up. the great weathering and the mine building and all that kind of jazz. It's just a wonderful scene. And the RGS did an amazing job as they came back across on the other side of Ophir and went back up toward Lizard Head. They had to go across a stretch of mountain that was ridge, canyon, ridge, canyon, ridge, canyon. And what they had to do is they had to blast notches in every ridge and build a bridge in between the ridges. One of the most amazing pieces of civil engineering. And this is the other thing that this artist did for Joel Shank, is he's the one that weathered all the rocks. They didn't bring in Bill Banta to do this work. The artist did the rock work himself. I mean, I don't know how many, what is he got? Something like 3,000 trees on his layout. Phenomenal bridges. I spent a lot of time weathering my RGS water tanks, but instead of using 3 different kinds of paint, this guy used pencils and streaked the vertical streaking of the leaking water tank mineral accumulation with pencils. Just did a phenomenal job of weathering this water tank. And here's the town of Rico. Again, look at that painted backdrop. And leading up to the painted backdrop is that mining trestle that leads to the mill that's right there. That's the Propatria mill. Just one of the more spectacular things, an incredible backdrop. Now, I've got the Rico Depot that Mike Blazek built with the individual shingles, but this is the same Rico Depot that Joel Shank scratch built himself. And there's the engine house and the tank and the depot in Rico. More of a backup view of the incredible backdrop that was painted by this artist. And the coal tipple, that was a Clifton and Burnett coal tipple. And now there's been a couple of decades ago, a Crystal River kit came out that you can make that tipple. There were a couple of those tipples on the RGS, and there's kits for them, but this was built in the day before kits. There's sort of a slag, runoff pile that they used when they mined. They weren't thinking about Superfund sites or where things are. When they had the excess from digging the tunnels and from milling the ore and all that kind of jazz, they found a spot and piled it up. This was one of my fun things that I did to Dale Kreutzer, is that he'd been down visiting PBL, and they've been promising to bring out this Uinta Mallee for a number of years now. But you can imagine how much engineering there is. And the other problem is you can't afford to build a run of 50 kits or 100 kits if you don't have people sign up and put a down payment down. You can't, in this day and age, take a risk on that much engineering and so forth. So I told Dale that in spite of his trips to PBL, that PBL was going to come out with this Uinta Mallee. Well, no, it was built by Jan Rons. This is scratch built by Jan Rons. The guy is just a master. I have one of his Rio Grande Southern rotary snowplows that he scratch built. One of the more amazing scratch built brass people. So this is a Jan Rons model, not a PBL model. And then when I was in Hawaii for a couple of weeks in January, I was on Kauai for a week, and Dale Kreutzer has been to this Lihui engine house several times. He has a much more extensive portfolio of photos than I do. He spent many more hours in the engine house, but this will give you an idea of what's there. This is a steam tractor. Those are the cylinders on top of the boiler. And then the counterweights and the crank and all that kind of jazz are behind the cylinders. And then in another picture, you'll see the gearing. These were used in sugarcane fields, field work in the sugarcanes in Hawaii. And you can see here that gigantic gear at the bottom is what they steered it with. And then if you look up by the corner of the cab, you can see all the gear reductions that go to the drive wheels. And then they had about 4, I'm not sure, I think about 4 locomotives. They were really interesting because they're 062 tank engines, and they are really interesting. I mean, these are what they use to haul out the sugarcane. They have several of these engines in various states of rebuild. A lot of them are tank engines. This was the most fascinating part to me. Colorado Mikados. K27s, 28s, 36s, and 37s were all outside frame Mikados. And Baldwin, the beginning of the 20th century, built a truckload of these and sent them to Central America and South America. They built these things all over, and they were, 3-foot gauge or meter gauge, whatever. But the thing they had in common is the springing. You can see the springing in these 062 tank engines that were used in the sugarcane fields have exactly the same kind of framing and suspension as the Colorado Mikados. Here's another shot from another angle. And you can see just how, and all those springs were all interconnected. So as one wheel dropped, the other wheel went up, and just an amazing amount of mechanical engineering. And this is the one locomotive that they have that runs, and it's all fixed up and steams up and all that kind of jazz. Thank you so much for listening to me. Hopefully my froggy voice allowed you to still hear what I had to say. Well, maybe I confused everybody so much they don't know how to ask a question, I don't know. But basically, as far as the engines are concerned, pilot and trailing trucks have to clear the frames, have to have flexibility, have to have weight. One of the real key things in steam engines is getting a lot of electrical continuity in that tender. Tenders can be a real beast.
I have a question. How big is the PCS?
Probably about 10 millimeters square and about 1.25 inches long.
So much smaller than the soundtracks.
The Soundtracks one tends to be kind of square. I think it's about, it's almost 1 inch long, I think, and it tends to be about 5/8 of an inch thick. So, if like the 2 geese that I was able to put it in have big loads in the back, and you can hide it in the load. But, and they'll work easily in most tenders, as long as they don't have a gigantic coal bunker. But
seems like Tomorrow Railroad had kind of a year or two ago.
K1 is about as big as the end of your pinky.
Yep.
When you do Soundtracks, it's about twice that big. You don't get as much time out of it, but.
Well, but yeah, so the KA1 is smaller, and it depends on what you feel you need. The Soundtracks one will keep your locomotive. I mean, when you shut the layout down, you've got some locomotives talking to you for a full minute.
Yeah.
Whereas the KA1 will only last about 11 seconds, but you ought to see my Casey Jones and my number 1 and number 6 geese run. They run flawlessly with the bigger, if you want. Yeah. So let's face it, the Keep Alives have saved our hobby. Back to you, Greg.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill. That was a great presentation. We'll see if we can figure that one out. Next month, we're going to do the Olympia Clinic, and we're going to invite actually anybody in the Olympia Clinic that's close by to come into the actual space. We'll also do it hybrid. Hopefully everything works. And I'm going to do a presentation on automobiles, detailing model automobiles to be as equally detailed as your rolling stock. A lot of places, a lot of magazines, a lot of layouts I've seen, they don't spend the time on the automobiles that they spend on their locomotives, and it shows up quite noticeable in pictures. So it's the same clinic I did about 2.5 years ago with some updates. I'm going to be presenting it down at the NMRA clinic, the regional down in Eugene later in the year. It's May 11th through 14th. So I'm going to do a practice run on you guys again, make sure I got all the details worked out, and look forward to seeing a whole lot of people in this room next time. That's the end of our presentation for tonight. So thanks for joining us.